In late 2023, Japan announced its highest defense budget in decades for the year 2024, $55.9 billion. This is set to rise to $65.5 billion in 2027. A pacifist nation since the end of the Second World War, Japan had placed its security in the hands of its American ally. But the situation is changing, and in the face of growing threats from its immediate environment, Japan is realizing that it needs to review its military doctrine and rely a little more on its own resources. In this video, we look at why Japan is rearming and what threats it faces. After Japan's defeat in 1945, the United States imposed demilitarization and far-reaching political reform on the country. This demilitarization is laid down in black and white in Article 9 of the Constitution that came into force in 1947. And I quote, "Aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized." Nevertheless, in 1945, Japan set up its Japanese Self-Defense Forces, a de facto army dedicated solely to the defense of the country, forbidding itself any offensive behavior. The American Army has also been present since 1945. Today, it occupies several military bases, as you can see on the map, notably on the island of Okinawa, just 600 kilometers from the coasts of China and Taiwan. Japan is thus qualified as a pacifist state, but as you can see, this doesn't prevent it from having the equivalent of an army and from not questioning the American presence on its soil for 80 years, in the context of current Sino-American tensions. It's also important to understand that this pacifist tendency has never been unanimously supported in Japan. This post-war pacifism is seen by some of the population today as a weakness, whereas it was once a source of pride. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe from 2012 to 2020 called for a break with this doctrine, or at least a move away from passive pacifism towards proactive pacifism. In other words, to strengthen its deterrent capabilities, and therefore to arm itself. In September 2015, for example, a package of security laws was passed, making it possible for Japan to come to the military aid of a friendly country, as if Japan itself were under attack. In 2017, Shinzo Abe said he had no intention of limiting defense spending to just 1% of GDP, as had been the case for most of the time since the end of the Second World War. In 2008 and 2014, the bans on arms sales to foreign countries were called into question. This change in doctrine is clear to see. Depending on the analysis, some believe that it was the growing tensions in Japan's regional environment that prompted this change in doctrine, while others think that this trend towards remilitarization has always been underlying, and that it would eventually have broken out no matter what. So what are these growing tensions in the region? Of course, we're talking about the tensions surrounding the Taiwan question with China and the United States. But that's not all. Japan is also facing other challenges. Relations between Russia and Japan are tense, especially since the conflict in Ukraine, where Japan condemned Russian aggression. Russia is also stepping up its military activities in the Russian Far East, notably by conducting the large-scale Vostok 2022 military exercises in September 2022, in which many foreign countries took part, including China, which accounted for the second-largest volume of troops during the exercise after Russia itself. These exercises were seen as, if not threatening, at least provocative for Japan, not least because part of the maritime exercises took place near the South Kuril Islands. These islands are controlled by Russia, but claimed by Japan, a historical territorial dispute. Despite this, the two countries can cooperate on a number of issues, including Japan's financial participation in the Sakhalin-2 project, which is strategic for Japan's energy supply. By 2021, Russia would supply 9% of Japan's liquefied natural gas, 4% of its crude oil, and 13% of its coal. Another threat comes from North Korea. North Korea has greatly increased the frequency of its missile tests over the last 10 years, some of which have landed in Japanese waters. This graph shows the number of missiles fired per year. North Korea is also continuing its nuclear program, notably by miniaturizing its weapons and diversifying the means of launching its nuclear warheads, whether by tractor launcher, submarine, or train, and it's working on ways to prevent its missiles from being intercepted. Given North Korea's bellicose rhetoric, all this represents a serious risk for Japan. Secondly, Japan fears China's rise to power. And on this subject, as you'll see, Japan's position is more ambiguous than you might think. In 2021, China represents 22% of Japan's exports and 24% of its imports, while Japan represents 5% of China's exports and 8% of its imports. We can already see a very marked trade imbalance. But we're used to it. China is most of the time in a position of strength here. And it's worth noting that trade between the two is fairly diversified, with sectors such as electronics, machinery, automobiles, textiles, and agriculture. In some cases, one of the two countries would import only one type of raw material from its partner, making it dependent on the other. In terms of diplomatic relations, it should be borne in mind that the memory of Japanese atrocities committed in China during the Second World War is still present, and there's a certain amount of resentment and a feeling of revenge. Another territorial dispute between the two countries concerns the Senkaku Islands, or Diaoyu in Chinese. Occupied by Japan, they're claimed by China and officially by Taiwan. They're tiny, uninhabited islands, but of interest to China. Their seabed may harbor hydrocarbons. Here you could see the disputed area between China and Japan, and the zones where China's already begun exploiting hydrocarbon reserves. In 2008, the two countries signed an agreement to jointly exploit the Changshao gas field. But this collaboration never came to fruition, and China began exploiting the field on its own, prompting Japan to bring the matter before the international courts. For China, it would also be a way of extending its exclusive economic zone and getting closer to the island of Okinawa, home to major US military bases. Japan normalized the status of these islands in 2012, when the government bought them from a Japanese businessman, thus making them the property of the Japanese government. China denounced this maneuver, stating that the Senkaku, or rather Diaoyu Islands, are Chinese. In 2013, China established its Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ, in the Senkaku region, overlapping the Japanese ADIZ. So an ADIZ is an airspace from which civilian or military aircraft must identify themselves to the country concerned, simply so that the latter can control the entry and passage of aircraft in its airspace. By including the Senkaku airspace in its ADIZ, China's sending yet another message. Note that Japan's ADIZ also includes the Senkaku, and let's not forget the incidents between Chinese and Japanese ships sailing in the waters claimed by each state. It's clear then that the two states have political tensions on the table, but for all that, they're closely linked economically, at least for the time being. Japan is keen to lessen its economic coupling with China and diversify its partners further, given that 30,000 Japanese companies have a presence in China. In 2019, a law on foreign investment will be passed in Japan, lowering the ceiling on foreign shareholdings in Japanese companies operating in sectors identified as sensitive from 10% to 1%. This law is particularly aimed at Chinese investment. It's also worth noting that a semiconductor factory run by Taiwanese company TSMC has been set up in Kumamoto Prefecture, as Japan prefers to have its factories at home in the event of a conflict between China and Taiwan. Since Taiwan is the world's biggest supplier of semiconductors, which is where Japan gets its suppliers, and these elements are indispensable to all of our modern electronic devices, bearing in mind that the electronics sector is important in Japan. Japan is far less aggressive than the United States on this issue, even though it recognizes the urgent need to protect its markets and reduce its dependence on its neighbor. Not surprisingly, Japan's a country with a very liberal economy, and we can point to two major free trade treaties: the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership in 2018 and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in 2022. These are treaties that aim to lift numerous customs duties and thus promote free trade between its signatories. For Japan, this is yet another way of boosting its economic exchanges with players other than China. It's also important to mention Japan's relationship with India, a key partner in its Indo-Pacific strategy. In 2017, they conceptualized the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, the aim of which is to develop, with the support of the Asian Development Bank, port infrastructures linking India to Africa and India to Southeast Asia, as well as trade routes linking Japan to Europe. India and Japan are investing in this vast project, which competes to some extent with China's new Silk Roads, a similar but larger-scale Chinese project. In fact, Japan fully includes the economic aspect into the theme of national security, and was the first country to create the post of Minister of Economic Security. In terms of security, Japan's also seeking to broaden its list of partners. Of course, the relationship with the United States remains essential and primordial, and Japan regularly reiterates this in official documents on its defense policy. But even if this is unlikely in the years to come given American interests, Japan also fears an American disengagement from ensuring Japanese security. So let's take a look at Japan's security relationships. It's already a member of Quad, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, along with India, Australia, and the United States. Its members carry out joint military training, clearly intending to demonstrate strength in the face of China. But Japan also promotes security cooperation with New Zealand, Canada, the UK, and France. It's also signed reciprocal access agreements with Australia and the UK, enabling the armies of one country to deploy on the territory of another. 2020 also saw the creation of the Japan Islands Defense Dialogue, which enables dialogue on security issues with the microstates of the Pacific. Japan is also developing its relations in Southeast Asia, notably with the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, where it's cooperating in the fight against piracy and terrorism. This has led to contacts between the respective staffs of these countries, as well as naval exercises between coast guards, and these are the first steps towards closer ties on security and defense issues. And finally, there's Japan's relationship with its neighbor South Korea. Relations have long been very tense, with Japan occupying the entire Korean peninsula from 1910 to 1945, and the Korean population being brutally repressed, leading to a strong feeling of resentment that's still present today. There's also a territorial dispute over the Takeshima Islands in Japanese, or Dokudo in Korean, rocks covering some 20 hectares in the Sea of Japan and occupied by South Korea, which could harbor hydrocarbons. Nevertheless, in August 2023, a kind of alliance was established between South Korea, Japan, and the United States, at the initiative of the United States. It's a security pact, and during their first summit in January 2024, they discussed collaboration with Southeast Asian and Pacific states, and the need to consolidate regional economic security. So, as you can see, Japan is trying to broaden its cooperation in this area. It's also keen to forge even closer ties with NATO. Japanese Foreign Minister Hayashi attended a NATO foreign ministers meeting for the first time in April 2023, and in June of the same year, Prime Minister Kishida attended a NATO summit. All these actions stem from the fact that Japan considers its security environment to be the most tense since the end of the Second World War, as we discussed earlier in this video. Its diplomatic Blue Book 2023 highlights the growing tensions between the powers that be, an increasingly pronounced split on the theme of values, freedom, and democracy, and a growing tendency for nations to reinforce their power and compete for international influence. Against this backdrop, he points to the failure of the UN to re-establish dialogue, and Japan's obligation to strengthen its security. Japan's official national defense strategy of late 2022 clearly identifies the three powers already mentioned, China, Russia, and North Korea, as threats, and it recommends strengthening Japan's defense capabilities and, more broadly, the country's entire defense architecture, as well as reinforcing deterrence capabilities in cooperation with the United States and other friendly countries. The document even goes so far as to mention the need to be able to repel any invasion of the archipelago. It's a document written by the military, so of course this kind of scenario is mentioned. But that doesn't mean it's envisaged in the short term. From the Chinese point of view, Japan's change of course is also seen as a threat. China criticizes this rearmament and raises four security issues in particular. The transformation of Japan into a major outward-looking military power. In concrete terms, Japan would no longer be a mere logistical support for the United States, but would play a more central role in the drive to isolate China. The integration of Japanese military forces with those of the United States, Japanese activities in the South China Sea, and in particular the military exercises carried out in collaboration with the Philippines, Australia, and the United States, and its relations with Taiwan. In 2021, for example, Japan and Taiwan met to discuss foreign affairs and defense. And in the same year, Japan joined the Global Cooperation and Training Framework, created in 2015 by the United States to consolidate international commitment to Taiwan. Moreover, Japan considers that a Chinese attack on Taiwan would inevitably lead to war. So the picture may not look very rosy, but in the final analysis, Japan is merely rebalancing itself in the face of the escalating situation created by the great powers around it, and in particular by the Sino-American rivalry. It aims to maintain the status quo, to avoid confrontation as it seeks economic prosperity. He communicates with China, trades extensively with it, and calls for a constructive and stable relationship. But real threats do exist, which explains its desire to depend less on China economically and less on the United States for security. More autonomy, less dependence, and preservation of the status quo and free navigation in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the Taiwan Strait, its main import and export route. That's all for today. Thank you for watching this video. You want to help me promote it on YouTube? put a like, or even better, a comment to boost the algorithm. And don't forget to subscribe. It's the English version of a French channel about geopolitics, and many more videos are yet to come. Bye!